Добрый день, коллеги. Мы начинаем.
Good afternoon, dear colleagues. We are on a very tight schedule here. We have only have 30 minutes for this important discussion. My name is Sergey Lozinsky. I'm partner and regional development director, Center for the Economy of Infrastructure. Here I will be moderating the panel, this discussion. One of the four public interviews with international experts that we will have today here. And now I introduce our guest, Leonard Brody, an entrepreneur. I am amazed how one person is capable of doing so many things while being young, to have so many achievements. He's a visionary. He's author on many books, and he has affected expert opinion on many aspects. He revolutionized various business fields. He's one of the founders of the such an innovation award, X Prize. He there introduced affordable housing nomination. Well, I'm happy that you are here. My first question is the following. Well, indeed, this is the age of agglomerations. Our interview is called Age of Agglomerations, Investors' View. Well, investors, as we believe and as the facts show, are relying more and more not on nations, countries, but they rely more and more heavily on agglomerations. Well, as we know, agglomeration level, but it is like a pie of many levels. In New York, in Moscow, in Asian countries, there are authorities, regional authorities, state authorities, and there are local, municipal authorities. There are also often intermunicipal level to cover the whole territory, and there is also there are city territories governed by the city itself, and there are special economic zones, techno hubs, technopolises, who have their own government, their own authorities. So what my question is, who is a better partner for me? City authorities, techno parks, special economic zones? Well, Leonard, my question is about, in terms of managing bodies, for an investor, what level of government, what level of authority in agglomeration, the highest one, or the or specialized authorities, or municipalities, or sub-municipal territories? Well, who is the most important stakeholder for the investor? And if we have a centralized agglomeration, can we have management on the upper level that would foster favorable conditions for investors or not? And whether it is determined or not by the field, but is it infrastructure, is it housing, is it IT? So yes, that was my question.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay? Yeah. I think from an investment perspective, the concept of agglomerations are really not new. As you know, agglomerations are mega cities. There's thousands of papers written on the difference between a mega city and an agglomeration. I don't really think there's any difference. I don't think it matters, to be perfectly honest. It's all several layers of the same cake. Whether you call it a mega city or a megalopolis or an agglomeration, you're just looking at the interconnected growth of urban centers, which we're seeing over the next 20 to 30 years, that close to 80% of the planet will live in urban centers. So whatever label you put on it, the question I think you're asking is, how do investors look at that from the perspective of what layer of government is most effective from an investor's perspective, but also who's the most important participant? And let me start with that question. I think when you're an investor, it really depends on what you're investing in. If you're investing in real estate, if you're investing in infrastructure, stadiums, arenas, land amalgamation, or technology parks, or technology companies. So I spend most of my day, 80% of my day is actually not what is listed in the profile. So 80% of my day, I'm a partner with a talent agency in Los Angeles called CAA. So I run the division of CAA that builds companies for all of the talent in Hollywood. So if you watch the Oscars a couple months back, 80 to 90% of the people sitting in that room were clients of our firm. So I'm very actively involved in building media businesses and digital companies and internet businesses for talent and celebrities and movie stars. So that's 80% of my day. 20% of my day is working, thinking about the real world and human living and human habitation and how cities are going to look differently. So I sit as a chairman of a property fund, a property technology fund that invests in property tech. So that's kind of why I'm here. But I sit on both of those. I sit on both sides of that argument and that fence. So I really think when you're thinking about, just to give you context about what I do every day and the context of my comments, when you think about investing, it's very dependent on what it is you're investing in. So I'll restrict my comments to technology businesses and entertainment, as well as then separate out the difference between that and just real estate and developing land. But the answer is the same for all of them, which is the most important constituent, the most important person in making a decision for an investor when you're in a large, amalgamated, mega urban city is the citizens. They're the only people that matter. I don't care. I mean, governments are very easy. You can either decide I can work with the government or I can't. And it doesn't matter what layer of government that is, whether it's municipal, whether it's state, provincial, territorial, you're going to make that decision very quickly. So if you look at coming to an area like Moscow or London and you need government involved in your decision, so if government is a required stakeholder, you're going to know very quickly whether or not you're going to work with them or not. And if the answer to that is yes, it should be a very quick answer. And if the answer is no, you move on. Once you get to the yes, the most important people in that decision are the citizens. And I'll come back to that because inevitably you just want to make sure that your product is being used. So many years ago, I was the head of digital for a company called Anschutz Entertainment. So we own the O2 Arena in London. Do you know the O2 Arena in London? It's a big sports facility, music facility. So that was an example of working with government because that was originally known as the Millennium Dome. And the Millennium Dome was a big, enormous, billion pound failure. And the Anschutz Group came in and took it over and very quickly worked with government to be able to turn it into what is today the largest grossing music venue in the world, from really a dead project. So that, I think, and they did that because they understood the needs of the citizens of London and what they were looking for and what kind of venues were missing. So at the end of the day, the real issue for investors is really focusing on, is there a use case or a business model or a demographic need for what you're actually building in the market, regardless of the level of government. If the level of government is supportive, they'll be supportive. If they aren't, the project won't get built. And I think the other thing to think about with citizenship, I think you also asked what layers of government are the most important. And I don't want to be naive with the answer because obviously government is critical to helping make decisions around landmass and around permits and zoning. But the problem is there's often a disconnect between government and the people they represent. And so about 2 years ago, I was asked to run for the mayor of Vancouver. So I live between Vancouver, Canada and Los Angeles. I live in the two cities. And I was asked to run for the mayor of Vancouver. And I decided to not do that. But the platform that I ran on was a very simple one, which is government. Government today is actually a very poor, in any democratic state, it's generally a very poor representation of public interest. And if you think about governments and parliamentary systems, we always had a check and balance. So in the United States, you had the House and the Senate. In Canada, you had the House of Commons and the Senate, similar structure in Britain. But the problem is those governments were based on they're based on two things. One, a technological assumption, which is 300, 400 years old, that is no longer true. And the second is they're based on patriarchy. And they're based on the assumption that large masses of people can't decide what's good for them. And the reality is we need to move to a system around electorals where you don't have a House and a Senate. You have a House, which represents the check and balance against the population, but it's the population that becomes the first cabinet, meaning all major issues should be voted on by the population. And they should be voted on not necessarily as a binding result, but as a key indication to government where people sit. So if you ran Sony or you ran Warner Brothers, you would never make a key decision without having deep, deep data on understanding your shareholders and your constituents. Yet government walks into every parliament across the world with about 1/1000th of the data that a typical business would make a decision on. It's irresponsible and negligent for the most part. And you see this repeating itself all throughout the world. And so I think the answer from an investor's view is what I said before. The answer from just a human being's perspective is government is severely, severely broken in almost every democratic institution in the world and democratic nation. And it's going to require a very key restructuring in order to make that work, to get to the data that you need to make good decisions about investment.
Thank you. Thank you. Большое спасибо, Леонард, очень интересный ответ.
Thank you for your very interesting reaction, for talking about the people that the authorities should represent. And in Moscow we see many investment projects being challenged if they do not engage the citizens, the people who are supposed to live in those neighborhoods. Well, my second question is that has to do with your personal experience, your professional experience. I know you invested into sports teams, athletic teams, massive sports and games with huge audiences. It's an interesting topic. Since the ancient Rome in 19th century, they disappeared in Europe and in the US, but in the 19th century they reappeared. There was a renaissance in a sense, and there were many factors that led to that, and now it is an important part of this urban life, city life, to have your own baseball team, basketball team. In Canada, a hockey team. Hockey is so popular. In the US it's going to be American football. We are more bigger fans of soccer here, but well, having your own sports team, athletic team, is a very important element of tourist attraction and of making people engaged. Well, over the last years, what we have here is in the early 2000s, there was a huge growth in popularity of sports fans. Right now, the interest is decreasing towards football games, athletic games, decrease in TV audiences, so sport is losing its popularity. So, Leonard, in his investment, well, he does invest in sports teams, and he thus combines new technologies with the traditional recreational activities, such as being a soccer fan, for instance. Well, my question is, in the cities of the future, how do you think, well, sport games with massive audiences, football, baseball, will they remain an important element of city life or not? Will they still be present as something that brings the people of the city together, and to what extent the implementation of new technologies can change the essence of those games, of those events themselves?
Yeah, I mean, sport, for, you could argue, 1,000 years, sport has been a really important part of city life. And what those sports are is totally dependent on the market you're in and the demographic you're appealing to. It depends on where you are. So in Canada, hockey is a critical part of the national identity. It's very, very clear that there is a direct correlation between the identification of both cityhood and nationhood to the sports that are available in your market. I mean, that data is very clear. Now in Canada, there was a very big debate years ago about should the public be paying for sports facilities. So should the Vancouver Canucks and the Montreal Canadiens arenas be built with public money? Now in the US and the United Kingdom, that's very common. In Canada, we made a decision to not do that, which I think was short-sighted. But inevitably, this debate came up about the link between sports and cities. Now, I'm a part owner of a football club in England, a professional football club in England. And the debate we're currently going through is about the connection between the city itself, the economic prosperity of the city, the importance of the football clubs of the city, And here's something interesting. If you look at a brand of a city and the affiliation of somebody who was born in or lives in a city or was raised there, generally speaking, in the sport of football, 93% of people don't change brands. So if you are a Dynamo Moscow fan or a Spartak Moscow fan, you are going to be a fan of that club for the rest of your life. 93%. So that's a very important connection to the livelihood of cities and the brands of cities and the affiliation you have to a place. Because inevitably, cities, as we move around and as human beings become mobile, the alumni group of your city is very important. It's very important to have a connection, and sports really maintain that. So I would say, one, sports is going to continue to be a big part of the identity and brand generation for cities going forward. And it's also going to be very important as economic development. If you look at the company that I used to work for at Anschutz, they were masters at setting up city plans. So if you look at London and the O2 Arena, there was absolutely very little economic activity in that part of London in that time. Now it's one of the busiest. And so one of the best things a city can do is to generate a new stadium for a new club with condo and residential development around it. Sports becomes this huge motivation and driver behind economic development in a city, especially when fans have been sitting in poor facilities and have not been able to attend games in proper facilities for a long time. I'll give you an example in Israel, by the way, because Israel's going through a massive regeneration of their football stadiums, and Israel's a tiny market. It's 7.5 to 8 million people, depending on how you count it. So in Haifa, where they had a very big tradition of football, they had a stadium that seated 14,000 people. Seasons tickets at that stadium for 25 years were about 3,000 to 4,000 sold. They built a new stadium 3 years ago called the Ofer Stadium. In year one, seasons ticket sales went from 3,000 to 20,000. The exact same thing happened in Beersheba, which is a city in the south of Israel. They went from 2,000 seasons ticket holders to in a new stadium, 13,500 seasons tickets sold out of 15,000. So sports are a very important economic generator for cities, and governments often don't take it seriously enough. The only thing I would say is, going forward, I'm not sure it's clear what sports are going to be the ones that drive the economic development in these communities. You have, for example, esports and gaming and more visual sports than participatory sports, and drone racing, for example, is becoming quite large in certain cities. So what sports are going to be popular in a decade, it's hard to say, but they're a critical part of every city, for sure.
Thank you. Thank you, Leonard. И у нас
And we have another important question of ecology and development of agglomeration, as we see, especially more developed, the ecological environmental issue is at the forefront. It's not about quality of life, but harmony, balance, equilibrium. It's one of the challenges. If you look at the projects of skyscrapers and large buildings, you see more and more popular projects of ecological design of the cities that Jan McClark started, and it's one of the cornerstones, and we are seeing real changes, but we have to introduce a lot of new innovations and new solutions from transport infrastructure, heating, nutrition, and it's money consuming. Of course, from your point of view, what is more important? The incentives are grassroots or equal pressure on the people, on the public, and on the government and the institutions, well, to introduce ecological solutions with less resources to spend, or it's only about grassroots initiative, or what is the optimal approach here? Well, to make our cities green friendly.
сверху или снизу должна идти.
I mean, is it more about grassroots, or is it from above, or from top, or from bottom initiative more?
It's a good question. Look, in my view, and this is just my personal view, governments have been horrible, negligent stewards of this planet. Horrible. And if you were smart, In the United States, particularly where class action lawsuits are very common, a lot of governments should be held accountable for the decisions they've made that are very, very negligent towards the environment. Government has not been a good steward and has not moved quickly enough to deal with the problem that we're facing. I mean, you can look at electric vehicles as one example of that. It is, in my view, criminal that electric vehicles have not been put on the road much sooner and regulated, or congestion charges in the centers of cities. You are very, very capable today. Like Volvo, I don't know if you saw in the news yesterday, Volvo is moving all of their vehicles as of 2019. In 2 years, every car that comes off the line at Volvo will be electric. Every single one in 2 years. And arguably, we are a little too late for the crisis that's coming. And there's lots of discussion, obviously, here in Russia about climate change being good for Russia and climate change being good for this economy. It isn't. It isn't good for anyone. And inevitably, regardless if you sell minerals or regardless, like as a Canadian, global warming has the same advantages to Canada that it does to Russia. You know, soon you'll be growing fruit in the north. I mean, but inevitably, if nobody's living here and there are no consumers and people are dying off and it's creating huge pockets of uninhabitable parts of the earth, it doesn't help. So I would say to your question that governments have been terrible stewards of the environment. They have lacked very, very real leadership. And where I come from in Vancouver, we have a government who is very pro-environment and has made the mandate to make Vancouver the greenest city in the world. The problem is, if you look between the lines, to make a city green, to make an environment around an amalgamated city green, takes very, very serious sacrifice that most people don't want and doesn't get people elected. And so most governments aren't willing to make hard decisions. The government of London did with the congestion zone, and I know they're thinking here in Moscow of doing it as well. But to get to a point where you're going to have a city that's functional and workable and environmentally desirable is going to have to come from the pressure from citizens, because governments at this stage have been very, very poor at doing it and have a terrible track record. And it's really going to be the generation below us that starts to demand it, where there's a connection between their economic, environmental demands and their voting patterns. And when those three things are aligned, you'll start to see changes in the city, I think.
Thank you. Коллеги, нас часто...
Colleagues, we have little time left. Perhaps someone from the audience would like to give comments or to provide some feedback or ask questions. There is one, yes. Yeah, we have time for a couple of questions.
Just one question. Since we're here talking about increasing the connectivity between cities internationally and lowering the borders of all over the actions, what do you think about blockchain technology and ICO? What's your opinion on that?
Yeah, so I'm pretty active in the blockchain and pretty active with ICOs. Are all of you familiar with blockchain technology for the most part? Okay, I won't bother you with it. So there's two pieces. The question, one, the blockchain itself as a medium, and then ICOs as a vehicle on top of the blockchain. So I think the blockchain is probably one of the more important developments digitally in the last 20 years. It's as important as the creation of HTML and the internet itself. And it's going to be utilized for all kinds of really interesting things. And I particularly, by the way, I'm glad you asked the question, because I particularly think the blockchain is one of the cures for the problems with democracy. That we should be running our voting systems off of the blockchain, not off of the crappy systems that we have now, which are duct tape and gum. And, you know, our freedom and our most critical decisions that we ask government to make, we vote on technology that's 400 years old. So I think the blockchain is going to be very important for voting and electoral infrastructure, but for everything from agreements to legal contracts to transactions and currency. So ICOs, which are initial coin offerings, they are going to be a very compelling way for companies to raise money until the regulators get involved. So in the United States, the SEC is starting to look at regulating initial coin offerings. Canada's a bit more complicated. But I think you'll see over the next 24 months, most of the regulators will start to look at it. So if you're thinking about doing one to raise money, better to do it now, because once the regulators get in, it'll be a lot more complex. But they're great ways. So for example, at CAA, at the talent agency, we're looking at very carefully when we launch a company for somebody like a Tom Hanks or a Jessica Alba or Jennifer Lawrence, when we launch that company, if we want to raise external financing for that, do we do it through an ICO? And we're looking at those questions right now, because obviously it drives. So I think it's the blockchain, if you're in business and you're not paying attention to the blockchain, you're very, very, very much at, it would be like ignoring the internet 20 years ago. Same situation, I think.
У нас еще один вопрос был, да.
One more question. So, yeah, we'll give you the microphone. You're welcome.
Скажите, пожалуйста,
could you tell the more efficient ways of a gap between the demand of needs of people, the city people and the city authorities, how to overcome this gap between the authorities of the cities and the population?
It's a difficult question, and everybody has their own views about it. My view is very particular. So I have a degree in political theory, so I spend a lot of time thinking about political realms and specifically around electoral systems and how you elect government. So if you think about how you vote today, assuming the vote is legitimate and assuming it's not tampered with, but let's assume for a minute that when you vote, it's a real vote. The problem with the system is what I said earlier, which is governments walk in to make decisions. So you vote for somebody who sits in a House of Representatives or a parliament or the Kremlin who is completely disconnected from your vote and your interests and virtually has very little understanding of A, what you want, or B, what's good for the population, and worse off, is not held accountable because there's lobbying and dollar interests that are happening behind the scenes. So there is a fix. And the fix is, and there are organizations working on it now. What will be created is the Wikipedia of elections, meaning right now I could take 10 engineers, and in 12 months I could produce an electoral system that was 20 times more effective and more accountable than anything we use today. We could do it in 12 months, and you take that code and you make it open source. So you create an electoral foundation like Wikipedia, which has open source code so that every government in the world can use it. They can implement it as wished and as desired, whether it's city, state, federal, doesn't matter. And we should move to a system of what I call pre-voting. So you have, as we saw with Brexit in the UK, you have referenda. But the problem with referenda is they're incredibly expensive. So they're expensive and nobody really knows what to do with it and nobody understands the questions that are asked and there's all the politics. The answer to me is very simple. There should be two layers of government. Government, which acts like a board of directors, so your elected officials should act the way a board of directors at a company acts, which is in the best interests of the company. Then the first layer should be you and I. And every major decision that government is going to take, you should vote on your mobile device. It should just be pushed to your phone. The fact that you have to walk to a voting booth is insane. You can order Starbucks on your phone, let alone being able to vote on an issue. So if government wants to legalize gay marriage, or they want to increase taxes, or they want to put a metro line through your neighborhood, they should be able to take a pre-vote, and that pre-vote should be public. Everyone should see the results of that vote. And if government disagrees with you, then at that point, they can say, we disagree with you, we heard you, here's why we disagree, and you know where to hold us accountable.
Thank you. Sorry, уважаемые коллеги.
Well, dear colleagues, unfortunately we don't have time left. The panel is over. Leonardo, thanks a lot. We'll have next panel in a quarter of an hour here. Expert community.